Welcome to the 7th virtual forum of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, popularly known as SALISES. This iteration, our esteemed panel will deep dive into the strengthening of national statistics for sustainable development through gendered lenses. Our speakers are sure to address critical concepts and issues in statistics for the Caribbean, such as who's collecting the data and how is the data collected, stored, monitored, and ultimately used to make decisions? Decisions which will no doubt affect a range of gender identities. What do the data reveal about our household demographics as it pertains to gender? Do the data wrangling or coding make provisions, and adequately so, for all gender identities in our societies? If no, who then is left behind? If yes, to what extent does this diversity of gender identity inform policy? Also important is what do the data state about the role of gender differentials in societal differences as we face common threats, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, natural disasters, and climate change? Who stands to bear the highest costs? How are the analyses derived and by whom and for what purpose? Overall, can we depend on the carvers of national statistics and the users of these statistics to truly cater to the diverse needs of the gendered individual in order that no one is inadvertently left behind by a version of evidence-based decision-making? What does the future hold for gendered statistics? To address these issues and more, today's distinguished panel in order of appearance are Dr. Leith Dunn, Honorary Research Fellow at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies Mona Unit, Dr. Philomen Harrison, Project Director for Regional Statistics at CARICOM, Ms. Isiuwa Iyahen, Deputy Representative at UN Women Multi-Country Office for the Caribbean, Dr. Asha Kanban, Consultant, Assessor, and Trainer at the Macroeconomic Assessment of Disasters and Needs Assessment for Recovery, Dr. Theresa Tali, Vice Provost, Equity and Inclusion, and full Professor of Pan-American Studies, and Dr. Peter Weller, Community Consultant and Clinical Psychologist. Please note, we've received word that Dr. Weller may be joining us a bit late due to an unavoidable double booking engagement, but we will keep you posted on this. For a bit of housekeeping, after being introduced by yours truly, each speaker will be given 10 minutes to present, during which time attendees are encouraged to place their questions in the chat. The panelists will respond to your question during the panel discussions. Please try to be as clear and as concise as possible, and if needs be, indicate to panelists you would like to respond to your question. All panelists are, however, free to engage with any question, provided time permits, of course. Now, before we give the floor over to our panelists, I would like to invite the Acting Director of SALISES, Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard, without whom these proceedings might not have been possible, to present the opening remarks. Dr. St. Bernard.
Good morning, everyone. And it's a great pleasure to be in charge of these proceedings and to host this session on behalf of SALISES and the University of the West Indies. I want to thank our chair for her gracious introduction, and at the same time, thank all of the panelists and virtual audience for their attendance at this very important webinar. This is the 7th in a series of SALISES virtual forums that we have been hosting. And it comes on the heels of the 6th forum, which focused specifically on the National Statistical Institute of Trinidad and Tobago and all of the imperatives that ought to be put in place to realize this institution that is critical to the development needs of a country such as Trinidad and Tobago. And I dare say all national sovereign states need to have national statistical institutes to serve their development needs. But in keeping with our discussions with respect to statistics and its importance as a driving force to facilitate all our sustainable development agendas, it was deemed important that we then turn our attention on this very important subject of gender and the whole idea of gender mainstreaming in sustainable development policy, sustainable development agendas. And for that reason, it was important that SALISES identified a series of a number of important persons who can actually deliver in terms of the quality of discourse that we have sought to maintain as we proceed with these forums. So it is not surprising that we have assembled the 6 panelists who are all esteemed professionals in their own right to bring to you the virtues of gender mainstreaming, and in particular, stimulate thought on how statistics can be infused in the discourses that we engage in when we think about bringing gender to bear upon the number of social issues and other issues that impact development process in our region. And I think this is very important because from the standpoint of a demographer, in my early training, much of the work that we did really disaggregated a whole range of social and economic phenomena according to the sex of individuals. But of course, my professional colleagues who are esteemed gender scholars have always emphasized, yes, while it is nice for us to have gender, sex disaggregated data, what is also important is how do we bring gendered lenses to interpret what these sex disaggregated data are telling us? And are there mechanisms in place in terms of the data collection protocols that we embrace to facilitate, a more appropriate set of data that would allow us to directly address concerns that bear upon gender identities? So it is these kinds of concerns that this forum is going to address. And I dare say I'm really pleased that quite apart from the fact that all of the panelists are indeed friends of SALISES, for they have interacted with SALISES in so many different capacities in the past, I too have to say that they are all personal friends of mine. For example, Dr. Philomen Harrison is a lifelong professional colleague. We both did our undergraduate degrees together. We were young statisticians in the Central Statistical Office of Trinidad and Tobago. And up until this day, we have continued to be fierce crusaders for the virtues of statistics in planning and development, statistics as a tool for training future statisticians and the promotion of statistical literacy. With respect to Dr. Asha Kanban, Dr. Asha Kanban has been a dear colleague with international exposure in the United Nations system, and she is also a dear colleague and alumnus of SALISES, having been the first to obtain a PhD out of SALISES in 2007. So we are very pleased to be associated with Dr. Kanban, and the fact that she is an alumnus of SALISES, and we are all aware and we all continue to admire the strides she has been making as a professional, doing all of the important work that she has continued to do. And I dare say she also lectures in some of SALISES' programs as well. So we are happy to have Dr. Kanban on board. Of course, Dr. Leith Dunn and Dr. Theresa Tali, they are dear colleagues of mine who I've known for more than 15 years, and I have spent so many hours in discussions with them about various aspects of scholarly enterprise and how we can advance the discourse to facilitate development agendas in the Caribbean and globally. And I am very pleased to reconnect with both of them and actually have them as part of our esteemed panel, and I look forward to their tremendous contribution. And of course, I cannot go without, making reference to Miss Isiuwa Iyahen, who I met as far back as 2013 when she joined the UN system. And I have always admired the tenacity with which she has declared her devotion to promoting agendas geared toward improving standards for reducing and eliminating violence against women and girls in Caribbean societies and, of course, globally. Ms. Iyahen continues to be a crusader in this regard, and I expect nothing less from her. And I am certainly convinced that her efforts will bear fruit and that we will be all proud of the contribution she has been making as an ambassador for the UN in this regard, in terms of frontally engaging, the plight of women and girls, particularly in the context of violence against women and girls. And last but not least, the only male on our panel, Dr. Peter Weller, whom I've heard a lot about prior to meeting him, but when I met him perhaps some 10 years ago, I was very impressed with the repertoire of skills that he brings to bear as a psychologist and his devotion toward promoting agendas that address masculinity issues in our region. So I can assure you that you are in for a treat with these esteemed panelists who we have brought together, and I am sure they are going to really enlighten you and certainly share with you the virtues of interpreting the gendered nuances that exist, whether as producers of data or as consumers of data that are disaggregated according to the sex of individuals, but at the same time, provide insights that would enable you to really rethink and rekindle, thoughts about gender as a critical concept that ought to be central in mainstreaming efforts as we tackle various dimensions of development policy in the region and internationally. So having said this, thank you for attending, all of you in the virtual audience. I want to again thank my esteemed panel for graciously agreeing to deliver the goods at this virtual forum. And I look forward to a splendid occasion during these 2.5 hours that we shall be meeting and talking. So thank you very much all.
Thank you, Dr. St. Bernard. A treat indeed. All right, so our first panelist for this morning, we go straight into the talks, is Dr. Leith Dunn. Dr. Leith Dunn is a sociologist and gender specialist with an extensive career. Her published works are in the areas of gender mainstreaming in social, economic, political, and environmental development policies and programs, covering issues such as gender and governance, gender and climate change and disaster risk management, gender, sexual and reproductive health, and HIV and AIDS. Dr. Dunn is currently the Honorary Research Fellow and head of the UWI's Institute for Gender and Development Studies Mona Unit. Prior to this office, she served as UWI Mona's Gender Focal Point, UNFPA's Assistant Representative for the Caribbean, and an advisor to several development organizations, including the UN and the Commonwealth. For the Commonwealth in particular, Dr. Dunn has served as a member of several observer groups for presidential elections in many African countries. Dr. Leith Dunn has also been the proud recipient of several awards, including a Political's Top 100 Most Influential Persons globally for her support of gender policies and gender equality, and the UWI Principal Award for Multidisciplinary Research. Today, I'm quite honored to introduce you to Dr. Leith Dunn, who will present on mainstreaming gender in development policies in the Caribbean. Dr. Leith Dunn?
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, and thank you very much. When my friend Godfrey asked if I could make a contribution, I couldn't say no. When I heard about the esteemed person, I said, oh my gosh, Dr. Harrison and others. So I'm really happy to be here today to speak about mainstreaming gender. And I want to look at 5 main areas very quickly: the commitments to gender mainstreaming and gender equality which guide policies and programs, some basic concepts, some strategies, the results, giving examples, and the takeaway is we have to mainstream gender in development policies to strengthen national statistics to ensure sustainable, equitable development. So here are a synopsis of some of the frameworks that we use. We have the CEDAW Convention, Women's Rights, the rights of the child, the rights of older persons, ICPD as a former UNFPA staff member. The ICD Program of Action says we have sexual and reproductive health for all. So gender is cross-cutting for that as well. Then of course, the rights of older persons. And I want to also highlight that the university has adopted a UWI gender policy. We all are aware of the Sustainable Development Goals, which supported or succeeded rather the Millennium Development Goals. The good thing is that in addition to gender equality, which is goal 5, gender is cross-cutting for all of these. And our challenge is to ensure that we continue to mainstream gender as a cross-cutting issue. So definitions, we know about biological sex, those physiological characteristics about males and females, but we increasingly recognize that there is a third sex. We're coping with transgender and intersex identities. So we have to factor these differences and diversities in our data collection, not just male and female. So gender is socially constructed. So it looks at roles, behaviors, activities that were socialized to say what is masculine and feminine behavior. And I'm saying that all development policies need to consider gender diversity. Another image here, we have different roles, those responsibilities and identities actually are associated with unequal power, unequal assets, different knowledge, resources, and risks. So we have wage gaps, we have issues around inequity, and the need to, excuse me, to ensure that our policies are equitable for all. I found this really nice picture because it's out of many one people, which is Jamaica's national motto, showing the diversity of our populations. And to me, it really helps to understand the concept of intersectionality. Yeah, so, you know, in terms of age, socioeconomic background, etc. So exactly what is mainstreaming? We say it is a strategy that is used to assess the implications of any policy that we have or a program. And the aim is to promote gender equality. But it's also a process that involves the collection analysis of data disaggregated by sex and more. So it asks who, when, what, why, and how as part of the whole process of mainstreaming gender and gender analysis. Also to note that the gender analysis is the systematic collection and examination of information. We look at differences, we look at social relations to understand where the inequities and inequalities are and how to redress them. And also for us to know that there are a number of frameworks that can be used for gender analysis. One of the things we saw, for example, is that using that disaggregated data was enabled to tell us about the gendered impacts of COVID. So we saw the increased vulnerabilities of households, job losses, increased gender-based violence, Isiuwa will talk about perhaps, and increased care responsibilities for women around, and that creates stress. So the sectors in which women and men are, in fact, are going to determine how we actually cope with COVID and recover from. An example of sex disaggregated data here from the Global Gender Gap Report of 21, all of it available online from the World Economic Forum, which gives you disaggregated data for labor force participation rates. So you'll see that females are less. Estimated income, you see a big gap there between what women and men earn in Jamaica. as well as other kinds of data which help us to understand where women and men are in the society. Another example here from the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Index, which shows our countries of the region and how we are ranked in terms of this Global Gender Gap Index. So, you know, we can work on looking at political empowerment, which is the widest gap we have, with very few women in parliament still, although we have had people like Portia Simpson-Middle, and now we have Mia Mockley and others who are heads of government. Economic participation, it says, will take 267.6 years to close that globally. Educational attainment is close, health and survival reasonably close, but the parity to us globally, for us to get to gender parity, would take 135.6 years. So here are some results. I just want to mention a few of them because they are the results of products of using sex disaggregated data and gender analysis. I want to specifically thank Dr. Philomen Harrison and Godfrey and colleagues and Alicia Mondesir. We have done 2 analyses of census data, and perhaps Dr. Harrison will speak about that later, but also mainstreaming gender in disaster risk management policies, mainstreaming gender in women's entrepreneurship development studies, in health. So we did gender issues in Caribbean health, a publication for family medicine practitioners, and also sexual and reproductive health, migration. We also recognize that there are journals which are in fact taking this information and you can publish in them, Feminist Economics, Gender and Development, and others. Global reports use the sex disaggregated data and the gender analysis. So there's more focus now since COVID on the social protection, gender wage reports, and of course, migration continues to be an issue. So with those few moments, I want to say that the takeaway messages for me, we're underscoring the importance of mainstreaming gender development policies to strengthen national and sustainable equitable development, but also building institutional capacity in gender mainstreaming to support equitable social, economic, political, and environmental development policies and programs. So we have our IGDS units, the proud mother, of these students. We're passionate about our BSc program. We have MSCs and PhDs. We have a summer institute in the institute in Cape Hill, but we're building capacity. So the takeaway for me is the importance of building the capacity, training persons, partnering with our national gender bureaus to ensure mainstreaming in all policies and programs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Dunn. And as we move to the next panelist straight away, we'd like to welcome Dr. Philomen Harrison, who is currently the Project Director of Regional Statistics at the CARICOM Secretariat, where together with several organizations, including the Standing Committee of Caribbean Statisticians and the CARICOM Advisory Group on Statistics, she is engaged in the process of strengthening the range and quality of statistics in our region. Her research work includes public sector employment in Trinidad and Tobago before and after the oil boom and impact of oil on Trinidad and Tobago, as well as the impact of macroeconomic policies in Trinidad and Tobago altogether. Let's welcome Dr. Philomen as she speaks to us on understanding gender as a cross-cutting concept, shaping the CARICOM Statistics Agenda in the 2020s and beyond, work put in place in statistics and the way forward. Dr. Harrison.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and to thank Godfrey, who indeed has been a great friend and colleague over the years, and to thank him a lot for having me on this auspicious panel. I must single out my good friend Leith, of course, Asha, and Isiuwa, and to congratulate Isiuwa on her recent appointment and promotion to deputy representative. So my story is going to be not on actual statistics, but more to indicate where we are at present and where we came from, and also to highlight some examples of what we have been trying to do in terms of trying to build gender statistics and some major recommendations. So one of the first activities that formed the foundation of the work in gender statistics at the CARICOM Secretariat would have been based on the 4th World Conference on Women held in Beijing in 1995. And I quote 2 paragraphs there, 206D and 207B, which relates to designating or appointing statistics, gender statistics program, and to ensure coordination in this area, as well as to ensure that producers and users of these statistics are regularly reviewed and there's sufficient coverage. So what about the foundation of these statistics? In 1999, a project on strengthening capacity for the compilation of statistics on indicators for conference follow-up in the CARICOM region was jointly carried out by the UNSD, the United Nations Statistics Division, and the CARICOM Secretariat. And it was grounded in terms of the gender issues and concerns as the main entry point for gender statistics. During this project also, we were concerned in terms of sustaining the capacity to continue to produce these statistics. And as a consequence, an advisory group was developed and a CARICOM program was established in 2002 in Dominica. The aim of the program was really to institutionalize the production of social and environment statistics and gender statistics, which was really the main topics under that project. So there were a number of capacity building activities and related initiatives post that UNSD CARICOM projects, and I highlight a few there. There were training workshops and in-country technical assistance through the support of a number of partners, international development partners like the UNFPA, World Bank, UNDP, and the EU, to name a few. There was also focus on civil registration and vital statistics aimed at improving statistics on fertility and mortality in collaboration with a number of partners. The Regional Statistics Program also collaborated with the United Nations Statistics Division, as well as with ECLAC in terms of a project on the elaboration of gender indicators for the English-speaking Caribbean, and this was executed around 2006, 2007. Other activities, well, Leith mentioned the census gender monograph. There were actually 2. The one that I was engaged in was from the 2000 census results, and it produced a very exciting report on gender and development, which was funded by the government of Canada. The Millennium Development Goals was also another area that led to further work on gender statistics, in that the 12th meeting of COSOD called for the MDGs to be made Caribbean specific and for the recognition of gender and women's empowerment as critical to the achievement of the MDGs. This led to new gender-focused targets and corresponding indicators, as well as a sex disaggregation of all indicators wherever this was feasible. So expanding from social gender to gender statistics, and this was done in terms of the partnership with UN Women MCO of the Caribbean, and there were a number of initiatives. I highlight a few: the gender equality indicators, and there were CARICOM GEI indicators that were developed as a minimum set, and the aim was to develop a context-relevant set of gender equality indicators, that were systematically generated to really highlight the socioeconomic status of women and men. Another activity with the UN Women was also the gender-based violence prevalence surveys, which was quite recently undertaken in the last few years, resulted in a commonly agreed mechanism to measure intimate partner violence, and of course the training of a regional pool of experts to enable the conduct of these surveys in the future. Yet another activity on paid care and domestic work, and of course this has found its way in that we are trying to establish it in the currently in progress 2020 census round. There are questions that we highlighted in this regard, in the Common Census questionnaire, both on recommendations by UN Women and based on questions done in the past by a couple countries, or 2 or 3 countries, I would say, that would have included them. Finally, another activity currently in progress, the Spotlight Initiative, which is focusing on violence against women and girls, that seeks to build capacity to understand issues and concerns that relate to gender violence, human trafficking, and the related concerns and policies. Right, other partnerships and initiatives I would mention, there has been collaborative work in crime and violence with our crime and security and gender and development programs, and it has led to the development of protocols for the access of administrative data from various agencies within countries. Also, funding support has been provided by the government of Italy, working through the Italian National Institute of Statistics on gender statistics, and 2 main areas. There have been the conduct of assessments on gender statistics in countries, at least 2 countries, and virtual training on gender statistics, and specifically on time use surveys. So you can see that we have moved from social gender to gender in this regard. But other activities, there has been collaborative work on human trafficking in the CARICOM Directorate. There were surveys that were done that we provided professional and technical inputs from in terms of the conduct of the survey, as well as in the review of the findings from the survey on human trafficking. In addition, relative to the Sustainable Development Goals, we were able to identify CARICOM core SDGs that were approved by the Council for Human and Social Development, and these would have included indicators on the SDG Goal 5 on gender statistics, on gender. In addition, some other peripheral issues that will inform how we do our work in gender statistics would be the development of online learning platforms, online knowledge base, and mechanisms for the exchange and standardization of data. And that all comes within the rubric of the regional strategy for the development of statistics, which I would speak to later. However, at this point, I would like to highlight some of the issues and the examples of work that was done on the UNSD CARICOM project. Often it is said that the focus was on—
2 minutes more, Dr.
Yes,
Harrison,
was
sorry.
The focus was on sex disaggregated data. But we started, for example, with the theme decision-making, and we look at the issue, the participation of women in parliamentary assemblies, and then of course we looked at the data, the indicator proportion of women that are members of parliament. The same for the one on administrative data. Another example is there in terms of working conditions, lower pay for women than for men for equal work, and we look at a special indicator based on that theme. Right, this would have been one of the reports that would have come out from that UNSD CARICOM project. Sorry. And these would be some of the indicators that would have come out from that project. So these are some examples, again, of the work with UN Women on the GI indicators. I'm missing my prompt. And these are some examples of questions which we have recommended to be included in the census on the unpaid care and domestic work. The RSDS, as I indicated, one of the main drivers there is gender mainstreaming, and of course, mainstreaming gender issues and concerns, and advancing the incorporation of and systematizing of a program on gender statistics are some of the key concerns that are included in the RSDS. So one of the key milestones also has been the presentation at our SCCS meeting of a paper on gender statistics, and therefore we have been able to delink the social gender from gender. So what are some of the recommendations, which I would close with? One, there have been challenges: under-resourced national statistical agencies, uncoordinated national statistical systems, and an ever-increasing demand for statistics. The SDG indicators, for example, 230+ indicators. So some of the key recommendations is the implementation of the RSDS, without which we would not have the adequate resources, and we would not be able to mainstream gender as a driver in statistics. Allocation of dedicated staff by national and regional statistical agencies to undertake the work in gender statistics, just as we do with national accounts and the other areas. There's also need to train a new cadre of staff in gender statistics, going back to the themes, gender issues and concerns, to make use of the online facilities developed, like the online training platforms, the knowledge bases, and the facilities to do research and development. Finally, centers of excellence in statistics already in progress. And of course, there should be a center on gender statistics and to mainstream gender in other areas of statistics. And of course, to do special studies in addition to surveys and the strengthening of administrative resources. And I asked the question, what should we see? Cross-cutting, mainstreaming, or thematic? Each has its advantage and disadvantage. And I just threw that question out to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Harrison. Too much to be said, I know. All right, we move straight ahead to our next panelist. Ms. Isiuwa Iyahen is a deputy representative with the UN Women Multi-Country Office for the Caribbean, where she's responsible for the day-to-day management of that office. Prior to her appointment as deputy representative, Ms. Iyahen managed the organization's economic empowerment and statistics portfolio. Her 17-year career in international development, particularly in the UN system, includes research and technical leadership in the areas of violence against women and girls, the labor force, social protection, and unpaid care work in CARICOM. It therefore gives me great delight to introduce you to Ms. Iyahen, who takes the floor on mainstreaming gender in the collection of statistics pertaining to violence against women and girls. Ms. Iyahen?
Thank you very much, Ms. Shepherd. And I really want to extend thanks to SALISES for inviting me. And I want to say thank you very much to Dr. Harrison for her kind words, and to others. I think I wouldn't have been able to advance my career without the cooperation of partners like you to be able to advance the gender agenda forward. So it's not only a personal delight, but a professional one that I want to reference. So I'll go ahead and with the presentation. I think what I want to say before I start is that all our work is anchored to ensuring that gender equality remains a priority. Remains a national development priority, remains a global development priority. So there's therefore a policy imperative in mind. And with that, I really want to thank Dr. Dunn and Dr. Harrison for setting the stage. They have already done half of my job for me in terms of really identifying what the commitments are in the normative framework globally, the commitments that CARICOM member states have signed on to. And Dr. Harrison, very importantly, also referenced the structural barriers that persist in terms of the production of gender statistics in the region. So all of that, I think, forms a very strong basis for the discussion and the presentation that I will share with you today. So I'm very glad that they have already set the stage in that regard. So I've decided to focus on administrative data, for this presentation. And the reason is that these are routinely produced statistics. And so they also very importantly give great insight into how services are delivered to people who have experienced intimate partner violence. And that's the focus of my presentation: intimate partner violence, domestic violence, gender-based violence. So for the statisticians on the call, I think you probably want to close your eyes and ears because you know this already, but for those who aren't, I just wanted to share with you some key definitions. Administrative data is any data generated through routine operations. They are drawn from service records, from internal administrative records. Administrative data on violence against women are gathered as part of the provision of services, whether it's in health, the police, the shelters, and so on. Any kind of institution that is seen to interface, whether directly or indirectly, with people who have experienced gender-based violence, domestic violence, intimate partner violence. And these are services to support a survivor and importantly to respond to, or they are you know, expected to respond to the needs of survivors. The data are also gathered in order to not only on survivors, but also on perpetrators. And these are collected, as I said, by different types of service providers, and I've listed them on the screen. So importantly, I think we also want to look at or address the data sources and also the specific indicators and what we are trying to assess. We want to know, yes, the number of cases or incidents. This is important. But we also want to estimate the need for such services. If it is that we see in a particular locale that there are high numbers of women reporting to a shelter, you know, for assistance, and the shelter is not able to provide that support. They may only have 20 beds, but on average, you might see that, you know, there are hundreds of women who are reporting for assistance. These are the kinds of things that we can use administrative data to assess, to actually estimate need, and also the capacity of the service to respond. So that's the next point there, that the administrative data can also help us to assess sector responses to violence and how far they meet the needs of women in this case, but you know, other people who may experience intimate partner violence, the numbers of cases investigated among those reported, the number of convictions also in the case of the justice sector, gives us insight into accountability of the system. If it is that you have somebody who was, you know, and we see this all the time, I'm sorry to say this, but it's true. We see somebody who may have been raped at the age of 10, and there is no decision on that case made, you know, until they are an adult. You can use administrative data if we collect and analyze these data properly to actually therefore measure the responsiveness of the system, but also accountability, and you know, and to hold the system accountable to the needs and vulnerabilities of survivors. Administrative data can contribute to evaluating, as I said, the response, but they cannot provide an estimate of the magnitude or prevalence of violence against women in the population. What administrative data can do is tell us about the incidents, as I mentioned, the number of cases. They cannot tell us about the population at risk, which is what surveys would do. The surveys that Dr. Harrison mentioned that were conducted recently in the region are population-based surveys that will be able to tell us throughout the respondents' lifetime, you know, when they've experienced violence, and that is different but complementary, equally complementary to administrative data. There's a background document, the link is in the presentation, and I will share the presentation on global guidance that has been developed on use of administrative data on violence against women, just to share that as a knowledge product. But the guiding principles remain that we are committed to, of course, a rights-based approach. It has to be culturally and age appropriate. We are speaking about closing gender gaps, but their intersectionalities, as I think Dr. Dunn would have mentioned this, with age, race, ethnicity, locale. Of course, gender equality and women's empowerment remain central to any work that we are envisaging to do on administrative data on violence against women. It must be survivor-centered. Safety and confidentiality is paramount. And then, as I mentioned earlier, perpetrator accountability. I mentioned this already, the priority usage should be to monitor the quality of services provided and the demand for the services. We want to understand the quality of the services delivered, case management within and across sectors, the essential services, health, the police, the justice sector, and so on. And we want to estimate the capacity of the response and the necessary investment needed to create the fiscal space, the costing and the resource allocation for these services. Administrative data can support that effort. Globally and regionally, we are working towards developing a minimum data set on violence against women and girls administrative data. Dr. Harrison is very key in that effort. So I wanted to mention that this is not in isolation. This is in strong collaboration with national and regional partners. The type of violence, the date reported in terms of the violence, information on the survivor, the sex, age, survivor-perpetrator relationship, information about the perpetrator, the registration of the event, where the event took place, was increasingly, with cyber violence, we have to obviously address the violence perpetrated using the computer or other technologies. Informed consent, obviously, anyone, that has done research, in this area, this is evidence that we need to prioritize confidentiality and establish standard operating procedures for informed consent. I'm out of time, so I will rush through the rest of the presentation, but essentially we want to map the needs of data. We want to map data producers and users as one of the key steps in establishing or strengthening administrative data systems on violence against women and girls. Coordination is important. Establishing and implementing training is important, obviously. Finally, I want to outline what, as an agency, we are doing. We are working on in this area, and again, it's not in isolation. With support from the Spotlight Initiative, we are working in Jamaica to establish minimum standards and protocols for the management of administrative data on violence. And this will inform the initiative I mentioned earlier, also within the Spotlight Initiative at the CARICOM level to establish these standards. Also in Jamaica, we are supporting the development of a minimum data set on administrative data on violence against women and girls to do what I presented before, to support the country in ensuring that at a minimum, there is data to sufficiently measure the responsiveness of this of the system and essential services to the needs of survivors of violence. And we want to broaden and strengthen the skill sets in this area. So there will be, Dr. Harrison mentioned the expert group on prevalence data. We want to expand that to include data on or the skill sets of that group to also be able to manage and be able to in the future train others on how to manage data on violence against women and girls. Also, I failed to mention here also data anonymization, qualitative research. We want to broaden the skill set of that group to be able to basically provide expertise to the region on data, management of data on violence against women and girls. Importantly, before I get to thanks, I should also say as part of the skill sets, we are working with SALISES initiative to be launched soon on an online course on management of data on violence against women and girls to complement all the other. I am ending, I promise. This is the last slide. To provide and to support the establishment or the strengthening of skill sets in this area. So soon you will be hearing about that course that will be launched. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I look forward to any questions that you may have.
Thank you again, Ms. Iyahen. Yes, I know. There's just too much to mention. We're moving to Dr. Asha Kanban now, a personal lecturer of mine while I was at the institution. Dr. Asha Kanban is a public policy expert, researcher, gender equality expert, and post-disaster assessor and trainer with over 40 years experience working in the field of development. Dr. Kanban has been a senior part-time lecturer at SALISES, UE, for several years now, and her published works include topics on disaster risk management, management of gender, and the adaptation of climate change, as well as the economic and social impacts of disasters in the Caribbean and Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Quite notably, Dr. Kanban has led the lead technical coordinator, on the social and livelihoods assessment of Tropical Storm Erica on the Commonwealth of Dominica in 2016, and was later that year invited to UNDES's expert group climate change expert group meeting, to contribute to the preparatory work for the World Economic and Social Survey on climate change, resilience, and inequality. I'm very much pleased to introduce you to Dr. Asha Kanban, who will take us through mainstreaming gender in the collection of statistics pertaining to the valuation of women's work and contributions to the national economy. Dr. Kanban.
Oh, let me make sure am I muted?
We can hear you now, Dr. Kanban.
No, but
Great.
Yeah, you can hear me now. Okay, good. Thank you all. And it's really wonderful to be on this panel. I mean, such wonderful, hardworking and effective women in the region and globally. I'm really pleased to be part of such a gathering. So I have to really thank Dr. St. Bernard, that dear soul, to gather such women together. So having said that, I want to focus on mainstreaming gender in the collection of statistics pertaining to the valuation of women's work and the contribution to the national economy. And it's an interesting area because normally I approach that work, but in a post hoc kind of way, because a lot of my work is in the field of post-disaster assessments. And it means that when there's a crisis in a country, whether it is as the result of the pandemic recently, which has caused me to undertake such assessments, not just in the region, but globally, or if it is as a result of a disaster, that the quick onset ones we are accustomed to, hurricanes and earthquakes and so on, or volcanic eruptions, as our colleagues in St. Vincent have experienced. I'm usually tasked with trying to understand what has been or what was before the event, the contribution of men and women to the national economy, and what has been lost as a result of the disaster. So I usually come to this task, as I say, in a post hoc kind of way, but having to address this topic caused me to have to rethink. So let's see if I can. And it's interesting that Philomen and I seem to have started at the same point, because I thought when we're looking at this issue of women's contribution to the national economy or valuing women's work, we really, I mean, the ideas were surfacing and were being discussed during that early decade for women between 1975 and 85, but they were crystallized. By the time we got to Beijing in 1995, so now you know our ages, by the time we got to Beijing in 1995, we were pretty clear, and governments were clear, and women were clear as to what were the issues that needed to be addressed in that regard. So the Fourth World Conference on Women, which I always say was a privilege for me to be there as part of the Secretariat and to be part of the women's movement working on it, we sought to contribute. It concluded that women contribute to development not only through remunerated work, but also through unremunerated work. Some of it in the productive sectors, family farms and businesses or SMEs, and some of it in the social sectors and in infrastructure. So in fact, Way back in 1995, we were clear that women contributed to development both through remunerated work and unremunerated work. As well, we were clear that women participated in the production of goods and services, both for the market and for the household consumption. And whether that took place in agriculture, food production, family enterprises, healthcare or education, we were clear that that happened. We were also clear that unremunerated work continued to be undervalued and under-recorded. And I was so happy to hear Philomena, Dr. Harrison, speak about the way in which they're trying to capture this data now. But I mean, since then, 1995, we were clear that this needed to be captured. Women's contribution to development is seriously underestimated, and thus its social recognition is limited. So once we cannot capture this data, once we don't have it recorded, once it's not included in national statistics and in frameworks, then women's contribution to sustainable development goes unrecorded. And the society just chugs along, thinking that women are, unproductive souls. So we have to figure this out, how we're going to change this phenomenon. And one of the things that, having to look at this topic that got to my headspace, and it's something I've been battling with for some time. And there's a wonderful book. I urge you all to have a look at it. It's by a woman named Mariana Mazzucato. She's an Italian economist, and the title of the book is The Value of Everything, Making and Taking in the Global Economy. And I really enjoyed looking at her work. And she suggests that we have to start with the notion of value. What is really valued? And what is value, and how is value created? And of course, the conventional notion is that value is defined as the production of new goods and services. And it is also defined as how the outputs are produced, how they are shared across the economy, the distribution of them. We're battling with that issue of distribution now, because when you talk about social protection, you're really talking about distributing the value that has been created in the society to those who are most vulnerable and in need. So it's the distribution issues, and what is done with the earnings that are created from the production that takes place in the society. How are those earnings reinvested? So we have to, all of that has to be considered when we're talking about women and their contribution to sustainable development. The usefulness of what is produced is also critical. We in the Caribbean are talking about resilient recovery when there are disasters. So we should be understanding and we should be right on top of the issues of what we mean by use value. If it's going to pollute further, is it useful? Is it just going to lead to more consumption? Is it useful? So all of these issues are fundamental to us strengthening the valuation of women's contribution to the economy. And we'll see how as we go along. I hope I'm able in the time allotted to get it all across. So value is created. It occurs when different types of resources, human, physical, and intangible, interact to produce new goods and services. So if you have an old recipe from your grandmother, how to make a very interesting tomato paste, that's your intangible knowledge, and you're growing your tomatoes in your backyard, and you take your intangible knowledge and you put it together with those tomatoes and you produce something exciting and interesting, and it hits the market and sells well, you have created value, simply put. So, sorry. Where did I go from there? Go back, previous. Right. So how do women and men work? We all know, and this is what we've been able to discern over the periods from the Women's First Conference to current, that women are engaged in, and men are engaged in, productive work. We are a cash-based economy. So when we are engaged in productive work, we don't normally engage in bartering. The outcome, the produce of our productive work, we receive a cash for that productive work. We are engaged in reproductive work, which is the caring and the sharing and the so on. And how much cash is paid for that reproductive work only when the skills of the reproductive work reaches the market. But when it's done at home in the domestic environment, we find there's no cash involved. There's not a cash transaction. The other kind of work we're involved in, both men and women, is the community action and the building of social capital, which is happening, but who is paying for that and so on? Is that all part of the unremunerated work, and therefore is it unrecognized? And then where does this take place? Of course, it's either done formally or informally. So how much time is spent on these roles? Philomen tells us we're engaged in time use surveys, of course, to get the answers to this. How important are they for sustainable development? Well, sometimes we think they're unimportant, but I think the pandemic has taught us that a lot of things that we thought were not so important, that took place in the reproductive segment of the work schedule, all of a sudden we recognize the importance of it, because when you have these children that you've got to oversight all day in a school, in out of school settings, and who did that? And how did that distract or from your productive work that you were receiving cash for? So how important are these for sustainable development? And how central is the contribution of each to the national economy? These are some of the questions that we're battling with. And we've got to have the data around those, otherwise we can't get to the answers. Where do women work? In which sectors of the national economy? Well, that's what we've got to discern if we're going to understand what kind of contribution they make. What is the male and female balance of labor in the statistics, in the sectors, and in the various subsectors of the economy? What is the male-female balance? We have to know that. We have to know within which occupational segments of the labor market are women and men principally engaged, and in each sector and subsector. What incomes do women and men earn in each sector and subsector? What are the returns to education in the sectors for men and for women? Are the returns to education the same? Or is the data going to show us that it's not? What is the economic flow generated by the sector? In other words, what is the sector's contribution to the national accounts and the national economy? And what is the male-female structure of the ownership of the enterprises in the sectors and the subsectors? If we're really going to understand what the contribution is, these are some of the ways we have to be able to dig deep. We have to be able to dig deep and get the answers to tell us something. And interestingly, of course, we discovered when during the pandemic, when we started to look at who was most disadvantaged and how, we know for a fact that the data told us that a lot of women can be found in the hospitality sector, restaurants, bars, nightclubs, entertainment, cosmetics, all of those, that whole area of work, and much of it in the informal component of those sectors. And then we had women in the care, health sector, domestic workers, caregivers to the elderly, caregivers in nurseries, caregivers to PW persons with disabilities, and women represented around 70% of the health workforce, but earn on average 28% less than men. So we have to look at where women are in the sectors. As I said, this is another. And we found that in the severely affected sectors by hazards, you've got a lot of women in those sectors. And that means that their income is usually disrupted during crises. And remember, we live in crisis-prone areas. For instance, in agriculture in the Caribbean, you have, in some SIDS, women comprise about 47% of the workforce. In the informal sector, the data suggests that 59% of all employment is informal, and that women comprise very high proportions of those who work in the informal sector. I think I've seen the statistics as high as 60%.
I'm sorry, Dr. Kanban.
Time up. I'm almost finished. Predominantly low wage. Okay, I'm going to barrel through. The wage gap is real. I don't have to tell you that. The data is there. What is interesting, and this points to where you find women, is that the wage gap is higher in the private sector and lower in the low end of the wage scale. So how do we value work? Very important, because if we don't come to terms with how work is valued, then we find ourselves unable to value women's contribution. And so there is the neoliberal worldview as to how work is valued, and the sustainable development view that women can be located in all sectors of the economy within structures that distribute income based on equal pay for work of equal value. We haven't seen that yet. Engage in activities that build resilience, and that women's and men's work would be equally valued, whether it is productive, reproductive, or community-based. So data collection through a gendered lens, these are some of the kinds of spaces or places where we should find the data that would give us that, allow us to do that kind of analysis. And then lastly, I'm just going to say the challenge. Martin Carter, our famous Guyanese poet, says you dream to change the world, not to sleep. And Andaye, one of our early economists, female economist, she was among that first group of economists that graduated from UWI. She has a book out now. So the book is called The Point is to Change the World. So in fact, we have to change what is called the boundaries of production and consumption for sustainable development if we're going to discern what women's real contribution is to the economy. And then we have to ensure that the next generation will not know the price of everything and the value of nothing. If we cannot value things differently, we're going to find ourselves,
Thank you, Dr.
We won't be able
Kanban.
to achieve sustainable development. I end there. Thank you. Good luck with the questions and comments. I'm ready to take them.
All right. Yes. Wonderful input there, Dr. Kanban. All right, we move ahead to Dr. Theresa Tali. Dr. Theresa Tali is the inaugural Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion at Dalhousie University in Canada, where she lectures in Pan-African Studies and is responsible for the progress and continued development of Dalhousie's diversity and inclusion strategy. Her scholarly works and publications are in the areas of social inequity linked to the intersectionality of race, ethnicity, gender, social class, nationality, and poverty. Professor Tali was formerly the chair and director of graduate programs in the Department of Pan-African Studies, where she, among other things, implemented a PhD in Pan-African Studies. She also served as Associate Dean for International Diversity and Community Engagement Programs at the University of Louisville in the United States. Please join me as we welcome Dr. Theresa Tali, who will deliver on mainstreaming gender in the collection of statistics pertaining to household livelihood and living conditions. Dr. Tali.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'd like to start by thanking SALISES, Dr. St. Bernard, and to the esteemed panelists. We are not just a panel, but we are a choir because we all sing in the same song. But what makes it melodious is that we are singing in different chords. So I am very happy and pleased to be here. On this title page, you can tell what the core of my presentation will be. It will be focused on human agency. I will talk about 4 quick points, given that I have 10 minutes. First of all, point out some of the importance of doing gender-based data collection in households specifically. What are some of the things we learned? Then I'll raise some theoretical issues with our methods and methodology, and then leave some questions about moving forward. Okay, so why it's important? It's important to do household level unit of analysis because all roads lead back to households. They're the units on which society is built. They're the central components of both the informal and formal economy, producing, as Asha said, for use value and market value. The role and responsibilities continue to increase. The role and responsibilities of households continue to increase importance with economic challenges. And as we engage in more informalization of the region's economy. Households are forced to be innovative in both their economic and social survivals. They're also the main source for socialization and for cultural traditions. We rarely see households as pioneering units of food production, preparation, sales, education, sustainable and safe environment, agrarian practices, food security, and the health and well-being of families and communities. Households, and in particular, women in households, are the main ones responsible for the dietary needs, preferences, nutritional values, the affordability, and so forth. What do we learn from collecting household gender data and conducting gender analysis? And I highlight agency, because all the data we collect, all the data we analyze, all the policies we make, we need to make sure that women's agency is at the core of this. If we focus on women's agency and men agencies in the household, we will recognize the resilience, the resistance, the way households and genders within the households navigate all forms of inequality and inequities. We will recognize the interdependence of the household economy and the formal economy and the role gender plays in this. Leadership. This is one of my peeves. Women's leadership roles are rarely recognized because of what we do and how we have been defined. I've been arguing for years, we need to redefine the concept of leadership. Women's leadership is often silent, salient, invisible. If we all recognize the roles of mothers, grandmothers, and other mothering, but we do not define them in terms of leadership roles, simply as matriarchal. Intersectionality. Women are not just gendered, right? We have multiple identities, but not only that, we navigate our roles. There's a lot of intersectionality with our roles, the family, the community, and self. Power relations, another one of my peeves that is linked to agency. We tend to look at women as, as the down end of the social inequalities and social inequities. We are the victims, and agency shows that we have power, that we do not allow ourselves to be marginalized or go into a minority situation economically or socially. We navigate these things. We seize the power of our social positions. We have a book coming out. It's called Beyond the Kitchen Table, Women in Global Food Systems in the Diaspora. And we have narratives from all over the diaspora. And what we have noticed in the narratives, how women seize that simple role of food preparation and engage in a power to navigate their lives and that of their families and communities. And we see it in all forms of social justice, in land reformation, fighting for the rights of land and so on. And not only women in the Caribbean, women all over. Indigenous women, this is their thing. How families live, household level analysis is particularly important because before we can engage in policies and projects and programs, we have to understand the dynamics within the household, how they'll survive, what causes them to fail? How do they navigate? What causes them to succeed? And what are the gender roles in these situations? So this brings me about some questions about the method and methodology. Are we using the right tools to measure and analyze? I put this there. Is there a subjective white elephant in the room? Audre Lorde, most people know Audre Lorde, famous African-American scholar activist. She asked this pertinent question that's applicable everywhere. Can the master's tools dismantle the master's house? So while we have made progress, great progress from the presentation before, there's no doubt, I'm so proud of where we are in the Caribbean and the work of the women and others on this panel, right? We never should rest assured that we are doing the right thing all the time. We have to constantly challenge ourselves and ask, are there still some aspects of colonialism, racism, Eurocentrism, patriarchy, and I'm sorry if you can't see it, but academic elitism, right? In the metrics that we are using, as opposed to indigenous measures based on our lived experiences. And when I say our, I'm including particularly the low-income households. Do we need a different set of gendered household questions or ask questions in a different way? I have found that particularly important in the research I have done. If you start a survey with who's the head of the household, guess what you're going to get? If you go all the way down to the end, you'll still get the same answer, but the information you collect along the way tells you something different. And again, the concept of women's agency and human agency doesn't come from the standard surveys that we know of. So we need to not only apply a gendered lens, right? And this is where we are currently. It's extremely important not only to apply a gendered lens, but to move away from the deficit thinking mindset that tends to blame the victim. And I have seen this in the feminization of poverty and everything. We tend to focus on the individual and not on the household structural and systemic situation, right? So when we're looking at drug problems, violence, alcoholism, poverty, we usually tend to focus on the deficit individual or deficit household and how we could fix that without addressing the structural issues and systems we find ourselves. Timing is good. Last slide, moving forward. First thing, somebody in the chat said something about qualitative research. I fully agree. What we should always do, I'm not saying we're not doing it, but we have to be conscious because change has to be intentional and ongoing. We must always ask those most affected. Do not speak on behalf of others, even if we come from those communities and households. We no longer are there. Once we have an education, we are privileged. So always ask those most affected, not just survey them. Ask them about in the construction of the tools we are using to define them and the measures we are using to define them, and use the gendered and anti-deficit lens when analyzing and interpreting the data. And last but not least, be aware of our own biases, not just personal biases, but the biases inherent in our training, study objectives, and tools. And it's not an accident that I put UWI's logo out there. So I'll stop there, and each one of these things is a whole panel in itself, but thank you for allowing me to share these ideas.
Thank you, Dr. Tali. Interesting stuff, all the panelists. I unfortunately must report that Dr. Peter Weller will not be with us just yet.
Actually,
I
know.
Oh!
and I'm, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so
very
much.
close. Colleagues, thanks again for this invitation. It's really, well, it's a little overwhelming to be in this group of esteemed colleagues who know numbers, because I am not a numbers person. In fact, numbers scare me. And I think that's not just true for me, but I think that's true for many other people. So I'll go back to you.
Sorry, Dr. Weller. May I introduce you just a bit so the audience can be...
Briefly.
Yes, briefly. Thank you. Dr. Weller is a Jamaican community consultant and clinical psychologist who has been designing and implementing behavior change interventions in the region for over 35 years. His work ranges from psychotherapy, psychoeducational programs, and training of graduate psychologists and medical students to developing violence prevention and corporate wellness programs. He is, among other things, a founder and former chair of the Caribbean Male Action Network, co-chair of the Disaster Mental Health Committee, and an elder of the Caribbean Alliance of National Psychological Associations. Dr. Weller comes with a wealth of experience. Dr. Weller will speak to us today on development policies, masculinities, research, and the role of statistics data. Dr. Weller, over to you.
Thank you, Madam Shepherd. Again, grateful to be here. As you heard, I'm a part of the Regional Psychological Association, who are now meeting and talking about disaster mental health, which I co-chair. So hence my having to wear two hats at the same time. But greetings to all who are here gathered. I am happy to contribute a bit from my perspective, which is, as you would imagine, that of a psychologist who's involved in behavior change programs. I think at this time and at this point in contemporary society, we are really challenged to try to facilitate development and healthy development. There is so much going on, and there is so much more that is going to go on. And therefore, it's so critical that all of us who are involved with this work understand the complexity of the problems that we're going to face and the kind of information that is going to be needed to guide our response if we're going to have sustainable development. You know, the gendered lens is no different from any other lens in terms of the complexity that it brings. It's just that it's now going to be one of many lenses that include climate and then include economies and wars and COVID and pandemics, etc. So when we talk about cross-cutting themes and intersectionalities, these things can actually shackle us, strangle us, and muffle us if we're not careful, because there's so much information to be managed. And therefore, looking at the statistics and data that are needed for sustainable national development through a gendered lens is something that is very, very timely. And I want to contribute, I guess, from a slightly different perspective. We're talking about policies, and we're talking about the purpose of these policies. The purpose of the policies is national development, regional development, sustainable development, but development about what? We're talking about society, and if we're talking about the society, we're talking about the people. And I think sometimes when we talk about policies and programs for development, we kind of lose sight of the fact that at the end point, people have to change their behavior. It's not about systems and rules and structures if it's not going to change behavior. If people are not fighting less, if they're not eating better, if they're not caring for their children better, then all the systems that are in place are not really working. And so I think that a behaviorally informed approach to policy is something that we need to continue to develop. It's not new. There are many who have taken this perspective before, but it is certainly something that we need to enhance as we go forward. And so, you know, some basic concepts coming from psychology have to be reinforced if we're going to talk about using a gendered lens. And I'll get back to the issue of masculinities. When we talk about changing people's behavior and programs and policies to change people's behavior, we know that they're the typical policy instruments. You know, the old time version was you have the carrot, you have the whip, and you have the sermon. You give them something that makes it acceptable, or you beat them into submission, or you talk it out to them. But of course, we have to move beyond that. And so we have far more appropriate contemporary strategies that have to do with bans and mandates and organizational programs. And we have the nudges, you know, the collaborative and integrated approaches that are now being used as we try to inform policy and have policy inform change. So those policy instruments we're going to have to upgrade. And one of the things that I want to emphasize is the importance of the partnerships. And I'll get back to that because it has particular relevance to the issues of masculinities. And I'm mentioning partnerships in this introductory part because when we talk about policies, we're not just talking about government policies. People's behavior influenced by the policies of the spaces they inhabit. And I think sometimes when we get into talking about statistics and policies and programs, we kind of tend to move towards the state and the academically informed systems that we want to put in place. And we lose sight of the fact that the policies of the church and the policies of the community and the policies of the private educational institutions and the policies of the media companies are very critical in terms of shaping behavior, and certainly critical in terms of sustainability, because if they're countering the message that is being given by the macro level ecological structures, those are the things people are listening to. And of course, we all know about the impact of social media now. So this behavioral approach means that we're going to have more interaction between the behavioral scientists and those who are operating on the ground. And I will never forget when I was the psychologist of the HIV program many years ago, sitting in a very big forum on a presentation, and someone sharing some data, and the woman sitting beside me, who I believe was a nurse, said to me, you know, that's not what happens in our clinic. And I said, how do you mean? She said, no, what he's talking about, that doesn't happen in our clinic. I said, well, put up your hand and say so. Oh no, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a researcher. I don't have that data. I said, no, lady, you do have the data. And your data maybe is more powerful because it's culturally grounded, etc. So who we ask these questions of and who we engage as partners, both in terms of at the policy level of influencing how policies are developed, and also in terms of the partner level of who is providing data and who is engaged in collecting data, I think are very critical. And all of these are part of improving how we use a more gendered lens to inform this whole process of development. Money is always critical, and allocation of funds is always critical. Yet we always, and I'm going to be very specific here, when it comes to work with men, we have a challenge with the whole concept of prioritizing and privileging, because for many people, it feels as if money put into working with men and masculinities is taken away as if it's a zero-sum pie from work with women. Yet we have to invest in that, and we have to be able to support the systems that are going to help us to understand the behavior of men. We can't talk about men as being the patriarchal power brokers and influentials and then ignore them. We have to intervene with them. And it's not just about engaging boys and men to develop the healthiest attitudes. It's also challenging the norms and attitudes of belief of the power brokers, of the men who are in charge. And that requires a certain level of investment and a certain investment of expertise to do that. So as we begin to talk about the issue of masculinities, as we look at policy, etc., I think we also then have to look at the policies that exist and how we have informed them. Now, a number of the presenters before have certainly dealt in great depth with the complexity of statistics and data and policy and the many changes that have taken place and what else is needed. So I want to take a little look in the few minutes that are left at how we need to understand policies and masculinities. I think it was Leith who mentioned the 4 W's of what, when, where, and who, okay? But there's a 5th W that does not get enough attention, and that is the why, the big why. Why people behave the way they do, why the interventions that are being designed in the way that they're being designed. Because if we don't have an integrated and coordinated approach, and if we don't all understand, we don't have to be on the same page, but we should be in the same book in terms of understanding this whole change process and what is going on. And what gets in the way of a lot of interventions with men, but it's broader than that, is that there's not a coordinated and strategic approach. Part of the challenge is that, from my perspective, we promote collaboration and we have policies about networking, and a number of donor and funding agencies now will require some kind of collaboration between the NGO and state in order to get funding. But people don't understand networking. They think networking is about everybody sitting at a table and sharing what they have done and what they plan to do. What we need to do is to facilitate policies that help people understand that if you're going to network for behavior change, you have to have a theory of change where there's some synergy and no dissonance or minimal dissonance. And that theory of change needs to include a theory of behavior change. What do you understand about who is doing what, when, where, so that you can have an answer to the question of why you're doing the intervention. As was mentioned, I've worked with CARICOM for a lot of years. I'm no longer as involved, but one of the lessons we learned is how hard it is to engage men. There is much resistance. And part of the reason is that magical word masculinities. There are many different types of men, and any man can move through different phases of identity as masculine. And therefore, you're talking about men who are angry patriarchs, and you're talking about men who are spiritual warriors, and you have men who are distressed dads, all because of the space they operate in and the identity that they're working with, which is what's the word? Challenging them in different ways. And if we're going to intervene with them, we have to go to where they are and find out what is going on. I mean, that's, everybody understands that, and that's why we collect data. But when we go to where they are, who are we going to? Who are we asking these questions? And I think one of the challenges that we face is that perhaps the wrong people are not asking the right questions and the right people are asking the wrong questions. And so we don't get the data we need to inform the policies, to involve the programs, to then inform the behavior change. What am I talking about? You know, we've done a lot of work, for example, in terms of policies around, let's talk about something simple, you know, engaging men in father care, engaging men to, so we want to work on paternity leave and we want to work on, you know, spaces for men to be with their children, and it has implications for the court and custody, etc. But where are the policies about teaching men to parent? Where are the policies about the skills? I know we've had organizations like Parenting Partners, etc., who worked over the years in Jamaica and in the Caribbean. But where are the policies that begin to teach young men about what it means to be a father and the skills that are needed? And this is particularly relevant because one of the things we're seeing with men is that more and more men are becoming engaged in sharing the care, but nobody has told them how to regulate their emotions. Nobody has told them how children develop. They don't understand the developmental stages. They don't understand the communication strategies that must be used at different stages. They don't understand the disciplinary strategies that are relevant and appropriate. So they do what was done to them, but they do it also with a sense of frustration because now they're in this role and nobody's explained to them the complexity. I'm simply saying that, you know, when we talk about what happens on the ground with behavior change, and when we talk about working with men, it's not as straightforward, let's teach them something. You know, you didn't tell people, HIV taught us, you know, don't tell people to use a condom, and they'll do it. You have to make it something that feels appropriate. You have to make sure they have the efficacy. I mean, you know, one of the capability, we need skills, the opportunity, we need to be there, and then the motivation has to be managed. So at what point can policies be developed that include the drivers of these behaviors? Because, you know, you can be a father in the space, but that doesn't mean that you understand what you need to do and have the efficacy. And that doesn't mean that you're motivated to work through any emotional challenges that you might face in parenting. Policies that allow, you know, visiting to hospitals. What are we talking about here? We had a colleague in Trinidad who had a significant issue where his wife, they had another sick child in hospital, a sick child at home. And his wife had to go home to be with the child at home, and he was going to stay with the child in the hospital. But the hospital had rules that no men were allowed in the hospital after hours. Why was that there? Because there had been a policy in place, because there had been some kind of inappropriate behavior by a man, or maybe to prevent inappropriate behavior by men. So that policy was there, but now it prevented a father from becoming engaged and playing a role in the care of his child because of a policy that seemed right-minded at the time. And so the other thing that is going to be really important as we look at not only just integrating masculinities and work with masculinities in this work, it's also about how we monitor, evaluate, and change policies to ensure that they do not become shackles, but rather facilitating a process of growth and development. I mean, there are many other examples that I could use. I'm sure Ms. Shepherd is about to give me a few more cues, but I'm going to just say that we need qualitative and quantitative research. And that is where the qualitative research is so valuable. It is about unpacking these things. However, when we unpack them, we need to have the right people analyzing what they mean. There was a study of the man box study that was done around the world, but it was also done in Jamaica. And it kind of began to characterize some of the dynamics of young men. But it was interesting to me that when I read the report, it was far more focused on how the man box shackled men, and really ignored the fact that men in the man box, for example, man box meaning more constrained by norms, were also more likely to intervene if they were bystanders in a situation of violence. They were more likely to belong to a group that was doing constructive things because of their need for affiliation. So, we have a way of using the man box to characterize men, and then focusing on the negative, when in fact there are qualities associated with masculinity and associated with how men perform masculinity that are appropriate, and not only appropriate, but beneficial for development of the society, of the family, the community, and the society. So I think in this little time, I wanted to bring a perspective that didn't include any numbers, but might include some ideas that would be of interest to those who are participating. I'm sure many of my colleagues on the panel have already considered these issues. But I think that in this time of uncertainty, when people are deluged with information, when people are, when you're under stress, you regress. So there's a likelihood to go back to overlearn old behaviors that sometimes are not healthy. It's going to be even more critical that there's a timely application of robust and valid data to policy that then is implemented right away. I'm stopping right now. Policies that make a difference in people's real life. Thank you very much for allowing that time and the flexibility.
Yes, Dr. Weller, I found it very difficult to bring all of the panelists' discussions to an end. I would sit here all day and listen to you guys, but I know you have other engagement and of course the audience as well. So we will now go into the next segment of our program, and this is our panel discussion. We have had a few questions in the chat, and I will now read the questions for the panelists. Any panelist is free to take any question. We will take them in rounds of two. I'll take the first two questions, and it's asked by Mr. Lancelot Busby, who asks these first two questions. Given the male-female disparities as demonstrated in the first presentation, how do we determine equitable development in the area of gender considerations? Question 2. Can we identify a gender czar in any or each of the Caribbean countries who will support the work objectives of the relevant gender interest groups, many of which are NGOs? So we'll invite the panelists to answer those two questions first.
I'll just start by saying that it is very important to be consultative and participate. And I want to really thank Peter for bringing that additional dimension. So principles of gender mainstreaming mean participation in decision-making, consultation. So in summary, I would say that you need to consult both. And persons with disabilities speak about nothing for us without us. So it underscores the importance of consultation. On the question of the gender czar, I don't like the word czar. I know it exists. A bit frightening. But in the whole area of gender mainstream, we talk about gender champions, right? I mean, again, a language issue. It's about leaders. I don't know if we could have a regional gender person because the contexts are so varied, right? So I would say at national levels, at institutional levels, we need someone who is pushing the gender agenda to create more gender equality, collect the sex disaggregated data, do the gender analysis, and so on. Those are my 2 bits.
Thank you, Dr. Dunn. We'll move on to the 2 other questions in the chat if there are no other contributions to that.
Yes, hello,
yes.
Alicia, my hand up.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Go ahead, Dr.
This is the issue of the gender czar. And of course, there is a regional gender czar. Well, yes, I don't like the word either, but there's one that exists, Ms. Rosina Wilshire, the last I checked. But I want to agree also with the use of the word champions, perhaps, and also that at the national level, that this is something that can be positive. So there is a regional gender czar at present. Thanks.
And Alicia, if I can make a contribution. I see Dr. Kanban's hand is also up as well. So I wanted to say that really a country's policies and legal frameworks reflect the importance that it places on gender equality and women's empowerment. And I think from that standpoint, it's important to then assess how committed we are as CARICOM by just looking at our policy frameworks, whether it is that we have gender policies or not. There's some countries that have tried to have a gender policy for 30 years that have been, it's in draft form. I won't say which country. And then there are some that have policies that don't implement them, that don't cost them effectively, because there is no policy, there is no program that doesn't have an impact on men, women, boys, and girls. And so, you know, whether it is you don't have a gender policy and at least you have an agriculture policy or social protection policy or policy to eliminate violence against women and girls that actually is costed and implemented, is demonstrative of the commitment to gender equality. And I think that while in principle, there is a commitment at the highest level, I have to say that in CARICOM, I have to say that when you look at in practice, what is actually happening, you perhaps see a different, you see varying levels of commitment. So I wanted to make that contribution as well, that, you know, there are no rights without resources. And if there isn't the level of investment required to close those gender gaps so that we have no gender gap in unemployment, so that we have no person, or at least very low numbers of people, I would prefer to say down to zero people experiencing intimate partner violence. And of course, we have a significant challenge before us. In terms of the czars, there is, I don't know how familiar you are with the Beijing Declaration on Platform for Action, but there is, there are at country level, in accordance with that commitment, national bureaus, national gender bureaus, right, who are responsible for coordinating gender equality commitments across the government system. And all our countries have, or at least most have, national gender bureaus. And each ministry should have a gender focal point. But again, various studies that have been done in the region have shown that these are under-resourced. So therefore, we are not unable in our governance system to actually, operationalize and meet the gender equality commitment. So I'll stop there, as I'm sure Asha, who has been in this business like long before I was even born, can perhaps, give further and even more valuable insight than I just gave. Thank you.
Yes, Isiuwa, I'm not going to, no, I'm not going there on the issue of the champion. I think there's enough said. And I agree with what both yourself and Dr. Leith has said. I just wanted to speak about the issue of the equitable development. I think our challenge in the region is that we are somehow losing our way about equitable, sustainable development overall. We found ourselves in a process with the inequalities, and the inequality gap overall is not shrinking, except in some countries it's stabilized. But unfortunately, we're slow to collect that data and slow to make it put it in the public domain. So it makes it even more challenging for us to analyze the data to see, for instance, do we have Gini coefficients that are current? Do we have more than one Gini coefficient for a country over 10 years? No, I mean, if it's missing, then how can you judge whether or not inequality is growing? When can you look at the consumption profiles and see, what's happening and so on. So I'm saying that the region is reaching a point where we have to be mindful that inequality is growing, and that the pandemic has increased or exacerbated the inequality that was existing there before. So it's very challenging, I want to say to Lance, very challenging to talk about equitable situations for women when we are in an inequitable situation overall. Women's inequality just is compounded and bombarded by the overall inequality. And that's why the argument now is for talking more about, for addressing these things theoretically from an intersectionality point of view. Because if we could understand that if you are outside of the right color framework that is being used in the country for opportunities and access, that you're going to find yourself in the region without opportunity and access. And then when you compound that with being a woman, you're going to be burdened with all the care and unremunerated work that you have to be taking care, absorbed with, then the inequalities are going to be worse. So my call is for us to check ourselves as a region and see where this the inequality is going, because otherwise, when we will be talking, you can't talk gender equality and achieve it if you are at the same time functioning in an unequitable and unequal society. That's, sorry about that lengthy.
Go ahead, Dr. Raja Tali. I notice your hand is up.
Thanks. I want to jump in here and also lead it to the other question. Dr. Kanban raised an interesting concept that we do not really understand. There's inequities within the inequality. And that's why, the household level, which Dr. St. Bernard asked me to focus on, household level analysis is extremely important because that highlights it. And also to a lot of the data we collect and analyze, and I understand the importance of quantitative data and policy implications, but a lot of it sometimes focus on the outcome and not the processes. And that's where the qualitative kind of research, and somebody asked about the participatory action methodology, that's where that comes in. How do we understand the outcomes? Is by understanding the processes and how these processes are being navigated and mediated. Remember, we always have to look at this. We are not talking about data as if it's some innate thing. We are talking about humans and human interactions. And so if we shift a little or alongside the outcomes of the processes and how these are being navigated and mediated, we could learn a lot on how to inform and implement the policy. And the last point and that's where the qualitative and the participatory action thing comes in. By doing that, they could help the qualitative research and so on could help us create a survey that captures some of this. So for example, when we want to know how many dependents there are in a household, because that's linked to poverty and everything else, I remember asking a household this, and they said, what do you mean by dependents? Do you mean the son that I'm supporting who's living with his mother somewhere else? Do you mean the neighbor that I'm helping with food or transportation? And so they have expanded the concept of dependence. And if we don't do that, we're not actually capturing the data of that household. And last but not least, apart from linking qualitative and quantitative and the participatory approach and so on, it's always linking the macro and the micro. Because we tend to make policies, right, but do not link them back to the micro or the macro. So if we're looking at drug abuse or child molestation or any one of the social ills, poverty, right? But as I say, we take the individual and the household outside of the structure of society and the system. And as we were talking about behavior doesn't happen in isolation. It's linked to the environment that that person is in. So we always have to be, even if our research is focused on the micro level or the macro level, in the analysis and the presentation and the recommendation, we have to go back to linking the macro and the micro and doing meta level analysis. Thanks.
Thank you, panelists. You've definitely done justice to those questions, without a doubt. We will now move on to the next set of questions. I noticed that some of the panelists have already started answering some of these questions, and we want to thank you for that. The third question comes from Desmond Perry. Desmond asks, since the collection of administrative data is an ongoing process and the integrity of the data is most important, what system is in place to ensure that the collection of administrative data is reliable? Question 4 comes from Okama Brook, and Okama Brook asks, how can academic institutions be effectively factored into the UN's monitoring and evaluation sustainability planning and implementation in the Caribbean? What is the role of PAR in the design of interventions? I will leave at PAR if Mr. Okama Brook would like to elaborate a little bit more on that. We would. All right. And the last question thus far comes from Bobby Andrews. In the area of educational performance, the gaps in attainment by gender needs urgent attention, he posits. Also, there may be pockets of excellence that are lost as the overall performance on average is low. The question now is, how do we distill the key success factors that enhance performing in order to enhance performance amongst boys? So I will leave those 3 questions for the panelists, and you can answer them as soon as you
Alicia,
like.
I think myself and Dr. Harrison have answered, so I wouldn't add more to what is already in the chat, but others can perhaps add more.
Yes. Thank you.
I think I addressed a little bit on the participatory action research, and I said it was particularly important because it allows those most effective a voice to share their experience, their perspectives, and the recommendation that we could learn from to either design a survey or to design a policy or to design an implementation of that project. So I hold it in high esteem when we're doing research, particularly on households and gender, and that it's not easy. It lengthens the process, but it provides a lot more information that is useful. For example, when we want to make a recommendation on an issue and how to resolve an issue, we need to study those who are actually navigating and mediating it and what is working for them. And what is working for them, then we could use to expand and enhance and support. And what is not working, we put a check mark on it so that when we are doing our data analysis and recommendations and policy, it is already informed by those kinds of conversations that the participatory action research, the focus group, the household level kinds of conversation, the qualitative aspects. So I'll just stop there on that, but just to say I'm a full supporter of it, Okama.
Yeah, I just also wanted to, do I have permission, Chair?
Yes, please, Dr. Dunn, go right ahead.
Okay, yeah. I'm a very passionate advocate of participatory action research because it provides knowledge, collects information from the participants who are impacted. So for example, years ago, doing participatory action research with workers in the free trade zones actually led to a lot of empowerment, development of an organization around advocacy, right, of free zone workers and to changes, right? Of course, the impact was that the companies picked up their handbags and left overnight, leaving them playing, but it certainly made a lot of policymakers aware of the atrocities of the free zones at that time. I've also used participatory action research effectively with studies on domestic workers, advocacy around Convention 189, decent work for domestic workers. And it means that it's providing some basic tools that the household workers, for example, can then move on for advocacy, more advocacy. And that was with the Jamaica Household Workers Union. So very strong supporter of that. And there's a question about the males. Could you just repeat that one for me, please? The boys?
Yes. In the area of educational performance, the gaps in attainment by gender needs urgent attention, Bobby Andrews says. Also, there may be pockets of excellence that are lost as the overall performance on average is low. He asked then, how do we distill the key success factors in order to enhance performance amongst boys?
Okay. So gender issues in education and the underperformance of boys is something that the Institute has done a lot of work on. Like Professor Barbara Bailey, Isiuwa Iyahen, and others. The Jamaica Teachers Association has also done conferences on how do we deal with how we teach boys. So it is about looking at the factors that contribute to less participation, looking at the profile of your teaching staff, the content of your curriculum, your disciplinary methods, and all of those things, right? And how do we encourage boys to actually stay in? Why it is they have to drop out, you know, of school and so on. So it's a whole comprehensive package of things that we need to look at, which is why we need, as Peter was saying, to look at it from different disciplines. So there are changes, but policies need to systematically integrate gender in education, looking at differential needs of males and females.
Thank you, panelists. At present, there are no more questions.
No, Dr. Kanban, I think, has her hand up.
I'm so sorry, I'm not seeing the hands clearly. All right, Dr. Kanban, please go right ahead and comment.
Okay, thank you very much. And I just wanted to say something a little bit about well, I've just my thought got disrupted. But let me just, oh yes, it was about the participatory research. We just concluded a very in-depth participatory research program looking at the impact of the pandemic on women. It was done in Trinidad and Tobago, trained a solid team of young people and women to be able to participate in this effort. And I want to totally agree with both Leith and with Theresa, Dr. Rajak, Tali, that when you want to get a deeper understanding of the way in which people are managing their processes themselves, so that you can design policies that allow them, not just policies that impose from the top down what you think is necessary, but allows them to have that agency that Theresa was talking about to manage their own situation, then that is one of the best approaches to do it. And it was interesting that I think it was, maybe it was Theresa that was mentioning that when you begin to examine things in that way, you find that when you talk about dependencies, because we were asking that question in a sense without asking them, how many dependents do you have? But people told us the most amazing stories about what was happening to them in light of the pandemic. And for one of the conclusions we were able to arrive at was that, in fact, elderly women, pension earners, became the most essential component of support for many women with their children, many other families then, and even for young men, because what was happening is that people were being put out of their little places of residence that they had been renting because they lost their jobs, and many of them were engaged in informal activities. So there was no way they were getting any formal support. and they could not access even the grants that were being offered by the system for, say, household grants to be able to pay their rents, because again, they were in informal rental situations. So the landlords could not provide the kind of data that the government required to allow them to be able to receive this grant. So what happened? Son, who was out there working in a little informal labor on his own, had to go back by mommy. And she had the little old house that the family had been using since post-enslavement, since post-emancipation, that one little property that is sitting somewhere on lands that they do not own because we've never regularized land status in the country. So you've got this little old lady in this little old house somewhere, right? So son comes back and he has no income and he has to be taken care of. Daughter comes back with her children to her mom and she has no income. And mom has a telephone, maybe of one son who's abroad who sent it for her. And that telephone becomes the tool that all the children are using for their education, to participate in the online learning. So these are some of the things we were able to unravel because we engaged in that kind of participatory action research. Whether or not the recommendations that were derived from that study will ever impact the policymakers is a horse of a different color, but there you've got it. You've got that kind of research which advises us the way in which we should treat with these families and their crises.
Alicia, are we out of time or do we have time?
Oh, go ahead. We have some time.
Okay, and I'll be brief, right? Because somebody asked the question, how do you incorporate PAR in UN framework and so on? You have to. You know, that was my last slide. These things are often not designed to be helpful to us. So we have to be creative to break that framework and that mold and still get the money to do the thing. So you have to be creative in the way you put in PAR in there. And it's important because as Dr. Kanban was talking about, without that level of analysis, we fail to recognize the resilience, the ways people resist and come out to be creative in the ways they navigate things. Who are the key players? So you have to embark on the whoever it is that you're seeking the funding for, that if you really want a realistic and successful recommendation and policy and plan, that this is a necessary step. Call it by any name you want to, but you have to make sure that it's in there to get these kinds of solutions going forward. I mean, otherwise you're gonna miss the boat. When we ask, farmers, we go to the male farmers, the head of the farmers, it's the farmer's partner that is making the decision for the male farmer. And we miss that boat if we do not take all of these things into consideration. So my thing is to break the mold and go for it.
Thank
Alicia,
you.
if I can add, Alicia?
Yes, Dr. Harrison.
Yes. If I can add, I want to support this issue of the participatory analysis. In fact, in one of the recommendations I gave, that is that in addition to administrative data, survey data, there's need to do special studies and research, because as Dr. Weller said, you need to know the why, and also this would also help with the how, right? So it will help give, another dimension to the statistics that are collected. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Harrison. We will now move on to another batch of questions. The panelists have already touched on the additional question to the previous question on PAR that spoke of how it can be integrated into the UN's framework and budgets allocated to research institutions to do the work. In addition, we have Lance Busby asking, in many of the surveys alluded to, the question of population from which a sample is drawn comes into play. For many such surveys, should a population be the national entity or the community? Next question. Sorry about that. Karen Bart Alexander asks, what do you all intend to do? I guess as the panelists, with all this information and well-structured information going forward. So I guess this is your opportunity to tell us.
That one is directed to Dr. St. Bernard.
So the panelists can, yes, I see a couple of the, Dr. Harrison, you can go ahead and start the conversation.
Well, with regard to the question on the population, the target population is very important. And in this regard, of course, the population can be stratified by geography. And therefore, in this context, it would be able to obtain some measure of data or results at the level of community. Of course, the reliability of it would come under question because it is a sample, right? And often in a sample, the reliability of the data at the level of the community would be sort of, I would say, a gray area in terms of how much it can tell us. So that I would say the target population would be important. The stratification by geography would be important. What may be necessary would be perhaps to have some special surveys at the level that can really bring out reliable and robust results at the level of the community.
Okay, may I, Alicia?
Go ahead, yeah.
So to the question of what do we intend to do with this, what we presented, I would have shared in I think the last 1 or 2 slides of my presentation, the work that we intend to do in the area of violence against women and girls data, which is to continue working with the Caribbean Regional Statistics Program with SALISES and so on to support capacity in the region on in this area. But I also dropped in the chat, if you will, the UN's corporate framework for the next couple of years and what the UN system will be doing in all the various country teams that we have in the region. And this extends beyond the work on data. So, you know, I would encourage colleagues on the call to reference it. There are various priority areas in the UN MSDCF that range from economic empowerment to health to climate change and so on. So it's there in the chat. Thank you.
Go ahead, Dr. Lee Dunn.
Thank you very much. So building the capacity of the younger generation. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, Dr. Dunn.
Okay, sure. So building the capacity. So I'm supposed to be quote unquote retired, but I still have students, make the time to share information and so on, because there's still so much work to be done. So that's one thing in terms of sharing information. Another thing I'm very concerned about is how do we translate some of these complex issues so the person in the street can understand? How do we translate it for policymakers who can only deal with 2 sides of A4 of a briefing paper to synthesize information? How do we adapt the tools to enable them to understand the critical issues, right? So that is one thing in terms of how we share information. The other thing is, and I really valued working with Dr. Harrison, Dr. Uche, and Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard on analysis of census data with Alicia many years ago, and also with UNFPA. And the issue of harmonization of data sharing, all of those things, So we've moved, we're shifting the needle a bit in terms of having access to information, but I dream of a day where we wouldn't be reinventing the wheel because we have the money or because we haven't shared enough. So a lot of information, a lot of research has been done, and it is about building, updating, and all of that. Last point is, I really want to commend Dr. Harrison on getting gender mainstreaming in the center of CARICOM. When I saw it online, I immediately called Alicia in Canada. I'm in Botswana, and I called her and we had a nice chat about the journey. And I think we had a conversation there. But institutions like CARICOM, the university, must take the leadership in changing the practices and changing the training that we're giving to our generation of students. So over time, we're going to see changes, and I remain hopeful about that. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Dunn. Dr. Rajak Tali.
Yeah, I would like to just say that we need to take the choir on the road, in the sense that no one of us could do this. And we each have a specific role that we are playing, but in itself cannot accomplish what we are talking about. So we need to work closer with each other. And, you know, and as I say, it's nice for me to sit here and critique the tools and lens and so on, but I'm not in the weeds like some of the people on this panel, you know, so we need all of those things. We need to work together as a group. And I will end by saying that when I talk about redefining leadership from a gendered lens, I see all these women on the screen as extremely important leaders in this project, because they are within institutions and structures and systems changing it. Because I'm sure if we had a different panel to talk about the experience, it was not easy for these realizations to happen, for gender-based data collection and analysis and policies. I mean, Dr. Kanban and they will know we've been fighting for years for this in the women's movement, you know. So we have to, you know, also look at what we are doing. And that's what I'm saying. We have to move away from the deficit model thinking and look at all the positive things that us as women are doing on this screen and in the households, you know, and in the situations that they find themselves, and not just look at them as victims, you know. So that's my thing, put the choir on the road and also build more choirs across the region.
Thank you, Dr. Rajak Tali. And thanks to all the panelists today for your invaluable contributions. I personally have learned so much, and I'm sure our audience has as well. So we will, I noticed that Karen Bart Alexander has said that the question with respect to the what is it that we're going to do moving forward was meant for Dr. St. Bernard. So Dr. St. Bernard will deliver the closing remarks, and he'll be able to answer that question, I'm sure, within that segment. But before we go on to the closing remarks, we will now go to the vote of thanks. Mrs. Theresa Best Downs, who's the Episcopal Delegate for Youth, Catholic Youth Commission for the Archdiocese of Port of Spain, will now deliver the vote of thanks. Thank you to everyone again.
Good morning, everyone. And I particularly want to borrow Dr. Rajak Tali's metaphor of the choir for this vote of thanks, because I think it is in fact a beautiful metaphor for what has happened here this morning. So for this conversation on strengthening national statistics through a gendered lens, we've heard a lot of women, and Dr. Weller, let's not leave out Dr. Weller at all, bring together various strands of a conversation that are so critical. And each person, you know, we could go to town on all the thanks we have to say, but I will be as brief as possible. To Dr. Dunn and all that she set us up for in really understanding capacity development and gender mainstreaming, thank you. Dr. Harris, for generally all of her work across the field. Harrison, sorry, my apologies. And giving us the question, I'm still sticking with it, cross-cutting, mainstreaming, or thematic. I think that's a very important discussion that she has raised for all of us. Ms. Iyahen, who is now Deputy Representative, UN Women Multi-Country Office, that wonderful discussion around administrative data and what it can and cannot do. Thank you in particular for that, because that's an important area that we need to really dig into. Dr. Kanban, who has done massive work, massive work, and this conversation about value and recognizing the limitless scope of women's work, and then, how do we understand a framework for valuing that which is limitless? Thank you for raising that conversation, Dr. Rajak Tali, bringing back up that Audre Lorde quote, asking, posing the question, whose tools must we use? If it's not the master's tools, whose tools? And everything that you would have brought forward. And Dr. Weller, that conversation about behavioral informed perspectives on development, I think it is critical. You brought together the entire conversation and really set us up for future thought, future fora like this. Thank you very much to all of the panelists. To our chair, Ms. Alicia Shepherd, thank you for your patience and your stick-to-itiveness and keeping everybody in line. What a wonderful job done there. Thank you to the Marketing and Communications Office of the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, for all of your consistent and professional work. The SALISES staff, that should really more be called SALISES family, because it is so much more like a family now than anything else. To Dr. St. Bernard, who Acting Director of SALISES St. Augustine, for bringing all of these fora forward. There's been a consistent set of fora now going on for the past couple of months, and making sure this happens, bringing together the choir, so to speak, and making sure everybody's singing well. And for all of the persons who are here as attendees, thank you for the questions, the input, the interrogation. The question was posed, what do we do now? This is an important moment, because it's not what do those people over there do, but what do we do with the information? So thank you for being here, but also thanking you for all that you will do with this information and all the possibility that springs out of this. So that's my thank you, the official thank you for today. And I pass back over to Ms. Shepherd.
Thank you so much, Ms. Downs. A lot of thanks today. All right, so without further ado, I will now hand the session over to Dr. St. Bernard, who will deliver on the closing remarks. Dr. St. Bernard.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I must say I'm extremely heartened by the choir and how well the choir sang today. It was a wonderful experience, and I'm absolutely sure that our virtual audience would echo those sentiments. More power to the choir. Okay, so what I have to say now, and I'll try to be as brief as possible, I would like to say that this has been a product of SALISES St. Augustine. But SALISES St. Augustine is just part of a wider SALISES unit, which we refer to as SALISES Regional. We have partners consisting of scholars and research teams and academic administrative staff located in our SALISES units in Keyville campus in Barbados and on the Mona campus in Jamaica. So we pride ourselves as one unit, SALISES Regional, and we really take great pride in insisting that we are the #1 think tank in the Caribbean region when it comes to issues of development studies, development policy, development training, and we are serious about that. We also pride ourselves as a multidisciplinary institute, and you can see from the various forums we have fielded so far that that is becoming evident by virtue of our reach in discussing a number of critical issues. Having said that, I want to now inform you that this week has been a very busy week for SALISES. We started the week with the introduction of the Spotlight series, which St. Augustine has begun, where every month we are going to have one of our fellows making a presentation about the work he or she does. And last Tuesday, we actually had Dr. Priya Mohan, one of our young fellows, who actually made a presentation as the first in the Spotlight series, and she presented on natural disasters and climate shocks, building economic resilience in Caribbean SIDS. And it was a wonderful presentation, and we are hoping in the next month to have another fellow making a similar presentation on the work that he or she does. In fact, that same evening, the evening of the presentation by Dr. Mohan, we hosted, and SALISES Regional hosted, this Arthur Lewis virtual distinguished lecture, which was actually delivered by the Secretary General of the CARICOM Secretariat, Dr. Carla Barnett. And she spoke on sustained economic recovery post-pandemic, this Arthur Lewis model, the Lewis model. She spoke about that. And again, that was very well received. Today, you are witnessing yet another presentation by SALISES, the 7th installment of the SALISES Virtual Forum. And by all accounts, as I said before, and as everyone has been saying, the choir sang well. On Tuesday and Wednesday next week, SALISES Regional will be hosting its 23rd annual SALISES conference. Yes, 23. We have done this for 23 years. And that will be organized by our colleagues on the Cave Hill campus. They will take charge of it. Every year, a different SALISES unit takes on the responsibility of pulling off the annual SALISES conference. And this year, it's the Cave Hill unit, it's Cave Hill unit's turn at the crease. So on the 3rd and the 4th, and I've already posted the document with the link in the chat. You can go see it, and you can certainly visit that event next week, Tuesday. So I just want to assure you that, you know, SALISES is very busy, and SALISES is about outreach and letting the rest of the world know that we exist and that we do very important work, and we want to share that important work. And where we don't have the capacity to do it, we can find colleagues who are affiliated with us and associated with us who can help us to do that. So in terms of other forums to come, I think next month, around the 20th of May, you can look out for a forum that is going to deal with post-COVID recovery and economic imperatives for growth and sustainable development in Trinidad and Tobago. As I said before, we try to deal with disciplinary issues that cut across the scope of inquiry in the social sciences and even beyond the social sciences. And we try to do it in such a way that we really address and attempt to redress, you know, various development challenges that we encounter. We are already pulling together a series of exciting speakers for that particular event. Beyond that, we have plans of doing a forum that looks at the Russia-Ukrainian crisis and the impact that it will have globally. We will want to get a SALISES perspective on that. We have a forum that will address that issue. And then in July, there will be a forum looking at the issue of violence against women and girls. We want to really take that on. And later on, we are hoping to have another one looking at guns and homicide in Caribbean societies. So there are a number of interesting forums that we have planned for the future. So I'm putting you on alert for what we have in store. Finally, to address the question by my friend Karen Bart Alexander, where do we go from here? Well, as I listened to this beautiful discourse today, what came to me, and I think I sent earlier the links to all of the forums we have had so far. So we are sharing this far and wide so that everybody has access to the discussions and what has been said. But we in SALISES have already begun the process of going through each of these forum statements and forum presentations And we want to get to the point where we can actually begin to put policy documents together that we can share with policymakers, not only here in Trinidad and Tobago, but across the region. That's one of the things we want to do. And secondly, I think it is absolutely important that a lot of what is shared in these forums, and they have been extremely valuable, I would like to see a lot of what we have discussed and presented in these forums find their way in the classrooms for pedagogical purposes and so on. I would like, as we venture into, virtual learning, that, what we have had here could be on course pages as videographic material that really brings home the icing on the cake, so to speak. So those are just, two of the many ways in terms of, moving forward. We really would like to see how we can document all of this material and have it out there, not only for various stakeholders in Trinidad and Tobago and across the Caribbean region and in the global south, but also internationally, because at the end of the day, it's not just about SALISES, it's about all of those who have participated in our forums, the panelists, the audience, because all of you have come together and made this the powerful engine, the powerful medium that it ought to be, if it is that we have to have the tools and the relevant ingredients necessary for tackling the voluminous, development challenges that we continue to face, especially in the wake of, the COVID-19 pandemic, its manifestation in various forms, and also the looming ill effects that would be associated with the Russia-Ukrainian crisis that has been emerging on the other side of the globe. So having said that, I would like to thank everyone for your participation in today's event. And we in SALISES continue to look forward to having your participation in future ventures such as this one. So everyone, continue to be safe wherever you are, and do go on to enjoy the rest of the day and indeed the weekend that is ahead. Thank you very much. But before I go, I just want to personally also congratulate my friend and colleague, Ms. Isiuwa Iyahen, on her most recent promotion. So Isiuwa, my heartiest congratulations to you. It comes from within. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay. Have a wonderful afternoon or day.